Hello, everyone. How are you? I hope you are doing well. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, our Accord Model webinar. We're here to help out our legendary managers in all walks of life, all industries. So I just wanted to jump in and say a quick hello, let you know that I'm here in the background. Our lovely Niall is actually hosting for you today, but I'm in the background. If you need anything at all, jump into the chat. And yeah, holla if you need anything. And yeah, I'm going to hand over to our legendary head of global partnerships, Niall, and I'm going to jump back into the background. So yeah, if you need anything, just holla.
Thanks, Hayley. Always love the energy Hayley brings to a room. Yeah, welcome everybody. It's nice to be here for another Pep Talk live webinar series. This month we're talking about something that's particularly close to my heart and something that's really important, I believe. We'll go into detail on what the Accord model is and what the Pep Talk Team Experience platform is all about in some detail in a moment. But first, I want to introduce you to our special guest. It's always exciting when we get experts on these calls who have something really cool to say about this area, and I don't know of anyone working in this area who understands leadership and messaging around coaching executives better than Colin Murphy. So Colin, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Niall. Hello, everybody.
Colin, I think before we get into the detail about how fabulous Accord is, which obviously, seeing as I designed it, is something we're going to talk about a lot today, but I think it's a nice place to start, maybe just a little message to explain to people who don't know you a little bit about your career, but also about your kind of philosophies around why leaders matter in the hybrid world.
Yeah, thanks, Niall. Again, hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. A very quick bio of mine. I started off in Deloitte, did my CPA, Chartered Accountancy there, moved into learning and development. Never knew it was a thing, but I found my sweet spot. I hope I did anyway. And from Deloitte moved into Symantec, so worked in Symantec, probably most famous for Norton Antivirus in its time, worked there for a number of years, became a director, took over exec development, which got me from that learning space into that coaching space with leaders. And then 15 years ago, you might see a photograph behind me of 3 babies. We had a bit of a seismic shift in our lives. We had the arrival of triplet boys, which meant I couldn't quite do the global role I was doing. So there's a bit of a rethink. So they came 15 years ago, and I was probably a lot braver then than I am now. But part of that rethink was actually leaving Symantec and starting my own business 14 years or so ago. So last 14 years, I've been working with leaders and teams across the globe in lots of different sectors. Teams and leaders are a special passion of mine. I mean, at the heart of it, leaders make such a huge difference. You think about, the classic research that people don't leave companies, they leave managers, and people don't just leave managers, they leave because of lack of leadership, a lack of direction, a lack of energy, a lack of psychological safety. As leaders, we create so much of the mood. Napoleon, in his wisdom, said that leaders are dealers in hope. And we make such a big difference. I think we've all experienced great leaders and bad leaders, and they make a difference. So that's been a passion, to help leaders pause and reflect and get better at what they do. But in that work, I also began to realize a leader is only one tiny piece of the jigsaw. And what about the team that they're a member of, and the team that reports into them, and all the teams around that? So a lot of my passion over the last few years, I've been doing a doctorate, which I hope I get my Viva on March 15th. I've been doing research on team effectiveness, working a lot more as a coach with teams. And I guess for today, I really see that teams are the fundamental building block of organizations, where potentially we could have done lots of things ourselves in the past. None of us have the knowledge, the skills, the bandwidth to actually do the work that's now demanded of us from our clients and our colleagues. So if your teams aren't performing well, you're not delivering. And we all face the pressure of do more with less. And my view is teams are the only way to crack that code. So hopefully I can bring some of that experience to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, you and I, we speak a very similar language, and where I suppose if we start with explaining a little bit of the history of the Accord model, which is why we're here, we as a company, we've been working with corporate clients for a number of years now, and for a long period of that time, we were looking at the challenge that companies had around their employees' well-being. And like an awful lot of organizations and an awful lot of research that's out there, it was very much focused on the individual. It was about how do you help each individual be better in order for the organization to grow. And part of what I felt was kind of being missed was that, yes, I mean, you have to acknowledge, and like, for example, you gave a really great example there of your triplet boys. I mean, you had probably a hybrid world moment 14 years ago, in the sense that the impact of your family life on your professional life and having to figure out what that meant for you and making decisions around what the future would look like because of the impact from your family. And people are dealing with those kind of things, and particularly all of that has been sped up enormously since the pandemic. But what we were looking at was how do we support organizations to build stronger teams so that you don't just look after the individual, but you also create more of a connection amongst the organization, which, you know, a lot of organizations have great kind of vision statements and values on the wall, but they don't necessarily live them. The day-to-day isn't living what they preach. So what we were trying to do was, well, how do we help leaders to connect these teams? Because there's tons and tons of research out there. There's tons, like, I mean, like in research for this model, I've been looking at, you know, there are so many team building models out there. You know, there's T7, there's Lencioni, there's Tenenbaum, there's Tuckman, which is the storming, norming, performing thing that a lot of people will come across. And they're all brilliant in their own right, and they all have something to say. But what I was trying to do, the goal of what we were trying to do with the Accord model, was to identify the motivating factors that drive great team performance. And from my perspective, I've worked with a lot of great teams in the sports world. I've worked with teams in the arts. I've been fascinated by any example of how teams connect together and build something strong together and why that works. So I've been looking at all sorts of different areas in building this. I mean, I've been looking at some of the things they've done in NASA, some of the things they've done in sports, some of the things that organizations in the corporate world who've got it really right have done. And what we started to think about was all of those models are pointless if your leaders can't deliver on what they're being asked to do. And sometimes the problem is that there's loads of theory, there's loads of academic research, but there isn't enough practical advice on how to implement this stuff in the day-to-day. Like, what does it mean? Like, you hear all the time people saying, oh, you need to be authentic. Sometimes the last thing in the world you need is to be authentic in a room, because, you know, if people see who you really are, it might not necessarily work in your favor. Like, it's not about not being authentic, but it's about understanding that, you know, Aaron Walsh, who's a mental skills coach that I've great time for. He's working with the Scottish team at the moment in the Six Nations, but Aaron is a New Zealand guy. He's brilliant, but he always talks about you have to build the bridge of trust in order to drive the truck of honesty over it. And that kind of thing is what we wanted to do with this model, was to build that bridge of trust, that understanding that being authentic only works. Giving honest feedback only works when trust and teams are connected. So what the ambition was, we're going to overhaul all the outdated systems and try to kind of build something that's practical for the future world of work. And with PepDoc, obviously, and you're a long-time friend of PepDoc, Colin. What we've done is we've built our check-in, we've got our team talks, we've got a TX score, which measures the impact of what we're doing. And it's all designed to connect our leaders and our teams together and try and build this principle of accord. So I suppose, you know, that's a lot of me talking, and you're the expert here, and people didn't tune in to hear me. So I guess maybe a good place to kind of start with picking your brain is, I'm kind of fascinated by, when I started working in sport, people always talked about team building as an art form. It was like something that like you had, it was something that you plucked out of the ether, and the great people just had it. But it was, you know, it was something immeasurable, you know. And actually what we're learning now is that it's a science, you know, that everything is measurable. And a great neuroscientist that I have had the great pleasure to work with a lot is a guy called Paul Zak. And Paul has done a huge amount of work with his company Immersion around the idea of measuring trust in organizations. But with that in mind, with you, when you're working, you know, like you've trained, you know, an awful lot of the executive coaches working in Ireland today, you've trained through the Smurfit Business School executive MBA program. When you're working with that in mind, when it's trust and, you know, authenticity and giving feedback and trying to create leadership that's a bit more connected to what the future generation need as opposed to what's gone before us, where do you feel the challenges are? Like, what are the things that you find are the biggest blockers for you in building that in the beginning when you're working with people?
So the blockers to trust, I guess a few things come to mind. I think all of us in our corporate world, we face an ongoing tension between task and relationship. And I think trust can get broken when we get too fixated on tasks. So I'm working with a team currently where relationships have it's an interesting team because it's a clinical team. And when I ask the team members, when are you at your best? It's crisis mode. Give this team a crisis and they click in like, I don't know, like they're the Super Bowl winning team or the most, you know, British gymnast, wherever you want. They are just super. And then I was asking them, but when does it not work? And it almost doesn't work when they're not so busy. And that's where people get quite they tell stories about each other. They get fixated on giving negative feedback. It all becomes about the task and not the person. And so I think one of the tensions is we can get caught up as leaders and as members of teams on it's all task. I'm just starting to work with a senior leadership team, which is doing really well, but and it's one of the parts of a core, but they feel like they have no connection with each other. That it's all about getting the work done. It's the ethos of the organization, which is a great ethos, right? It gets results, but it's almost results and tasks before people. And I not advocating we go the other way around, but I think you have to do both. So I think an obsession with task breaks relationships and trust. I think it's also breaking trust down to different components. You know, trust is do I trust your competence? That's one aspect of trust. Or do I trust your accountability? So when you say you're going to do something, do you do it? And a third aspect is, do I trust your integrity? I think sometimes the one that really throws things up, teams don't always talk about, do we trust the competence of each other? And that goes back to the D of a chord, almost like, are we all clear what the direction is? Because I won't trust you being able to do a job unless I'm clear about what are we all trying to achieve. So that gets in the way. Do I really trust the competence? But I also think the accountability thing gets in the way. And that goes back to that task focus. So many leaders and team members I work with, they are just overwhelmed with the workload. And that lack of direction and prioritization and being on the same page means they're chasing everything. So everything looks important. And that does rupture relationships because they can't always follow through on commitments. And I think, yeah, so there's just some thoughts in mind about what gets in the way of trust. As I said, sorry, the other thing, sorry, just I think about is just our ability, and I just demonstrated how not to do it there, but actually listening to each other and giving people, all right. So I just demoed 101 how not to. I just talked over now, but how do we make time to listen to each other? You know, I can hear the cynic going, oh, geez, soft skills. I mean, that just drives me nutty. These are the hardest skills. Give me a project plan any day to create. That's easy, right? These so-called soft skills, that's just smoke and mirrors. These are the hard skills. They involve patience. They involve listening. They involve bringing people with me. I mean, that's the real engine of the stuff here. So I think trust gets broken because we lose contact with the person.
Yeah, and it's funny because one of the pieces of research that that I find is absolutely aligned with where my head goes to, and actually trust is such a core element of it, is there's a slide on screen at the moment, but it's talking about the MIT Human Dynamics Lab. They did some research back in 2012, and it's something that I've used in the work I've done with sports teams. But it was talking about the 3 E's, the kind of the elusive group dynamics that characterize high performing teams. And they talked about energy, engagement, and exploration. And what they were kind of talking about there was the energy you bring to meetings, the energy you bring to interactions. It's not just about, like, you know, we all do calisthenics in the morning and now we're full of energy and we're awesome. Like, but it was more, you know, where are you bringing your energy and when? The engagement, kind of talking about how partially engaged teams made worse decisions. And sometimes when you talk about teams who are brilliant at crisis mode and problem solving, it's because they've made poor decisions all along, and then they get to the crisis mode, and could they be better and avoid that stress? And then the exploration, and one of the things I think is really interesting is that higher performing teams seek outside connections. And that kind of thing about, you know, sometimes we've a tendency to protect our expertise, or to feel like, oh, you know, we need to keep this inside. And the greatest leaders I've worked with have always been really comfortable with everybody else getting praise and getting recognized, and because they're building. In fact, the best leaders I've worked with had a very clear plan for people to take over their roles. They trained people to do their jobs, and it's kind of like they would feel a failure if they moved on from a role and there was nobody there to take it on. So it's that kind of idea about exploration and engaging people from other areas. What I do think is interesting, and it's fascinating for me, that increasingly science is moving into this area. And what we try to do at Pep Talk is create a measurement. So we try to give practical advice. So for people listening, you know, there are opportunities to hear people like Colin talking on the Pep Talk platform, explaining practical advice on how to build some of these things. But it's also then about the measurement, the TX score, the understanding that when we do some work around team experience, that there's a score you get, and that is information then that allows you to make decisions on where you go next. What I thought was particularly interesting is the Scientific American website. This came from some work I was looking at with NASA and some of the scientific societies in America. And they talk about how it's remarkable how we've been, in society, we've been fascinated with the individual when, you know, just given the centrality of the team, the work teams do. And one of this, there's a quote there on the right-hand side of the screen for people looking, but it just talks about how science strongly suggests that, you know, the work we do when we're put together as a team, it doesn't just have a massive impact on our ability to perform and our output, but it also has a massive impact on us intrinsically, and our connections and our sense of self and our ability to work together. So I've been talking about Accord a lot, and what I wanted to do was maybe give people a little bit of an understanding of what Accord is. So that's kind of explaining a little bit of the why, the understanding that there are teams who can massively benefit from understanding ways to connect. And there's a couple of quotes that I had there. I mean, one is from there's a guy called Craig Fulton, who's a coach I've worked with for years, and Craig has been he was the most successful male our most successful head coach of the Irish men's team in history. He moved to Belgium, where he's been on the coaching ticket that had led Belgium to the first team in history to hold the World, European and Olympic titles at the same time. And last year he led his club team in Belgium to their first league title in 80 years, and he got voted Coach of the Year. He's a guy who understands teams, connection and motivation, and he uses the basic fundamentals. He says there, my team success has been built on the basic fundamentals of Accord. The reason he says that, the reason he says Accord is at the heart of his coaching, is like, Craig and I have worked together for years, and I have introduced this idea of Accord to him, and it's all based on the idea. There's another quote there. One of the things that we're finding the team that is that team performance is not something that you build one time and it sticks. It requires regular check-in, and that's from Leslie to Church at NASA. So understanding that it's not about a one-time thing, and your work is around coaching people to consistently raise their level of performance and consistently raise the people around them. Where do you see the kind of sweet spot for leaders in that kind of thing about it's not a one-off thing and it sticks? You've got to check in. So how do you kind of, when you're coaching with them, how do you help them to understand that, you know, it's okay not to get it right the first time, but you need to be thinking about the measurements and revisit it and reigniting it all the time?
Well, just to go back to the one-off thing, I think that's where a lot of us have come from when we even think of team development. We think of, we go off and build a raft, or we go to have a social night out, and those events, team building events, the research is really mixed on whether it makes a difference. It can often end up rupturing relationships as much as anything else. I mean, they're a shared experience, but I think I'm seeing a real shift recently on rethinking team development to this idea that one-off does not get you a team, right? It's a start of the conversation. And even you'll see with a cord or any team model, you know, it's an important map, but it's not linear, and it's not one component. There's lots of factors going on here. I mean, a cord is a lovely acronym, but you could start in the other direction as well and call it, I don't know, the Dorka model, or it wouldn't be sense nice, but that they're all moving around. So I think it's helping leaders think about team development as a series of conversations. And that's the biggest aha I have with leaders and teams is, I'm generalizing, but teams rarely get to stop and pause and reflect and ask the question, how are we doing? And the great thing about teams is, yes, stakeholders are key, and we want to make them go outside in their approach. But so much of what gets in the way of the team performing is actually in the gift of the team. And yet, because a team is always running and always going forward, it never gets to do the video analysis. It never even gets to be in the changing room at halftime, to use sporting analogies. And you talked earlier on about energy, engagement, exploration. Just for many of us, think about the energy around team meetings. Think about the next team meeting any of us are going to attend. Are you looking forward to it? Are you excited about it? Do you wish it was cancelled? If the boss wasn't there, would it even be held? I was part of a senior leadership team. We had we're running a EMEA, sales organization running a EMEA, you know, multi-million-dollar targets. And if the boss didn't show up, we'd all just sit around. It's a disgrace. But it wasn't the team for that very reason. It was hub and spoke. So I think, you know, checking into your own team, what's the energy you or the team have around team meetings? I think a lot of that is because team meetings have become vehicles for information update. And everybody says, Niall says his piece, and Colin says his piece, and Haley says her piece, and I'm half interested in her. I'm definitely not interested in Niall's piece, nothing to do with me. And I sit there wait for my turn. And you know, team meetings should be productive. Are we making decisions? Let's get some work done together. And I think we can be harsh on meetings. Maybe there are too many, but I think it's the quality of team meetings. They lack purpose and clarity. And again, I think it's a good check for any of us. How energetic would our teams be about our team meetings if they're on this call right now? Or how energetic are you about the teams that you're a member of when you get together? And it's also back to that engagement part, because most teams I work with, they only get to see each other in the team meeting. Teams are when you're together and when you're apart. You're wearing this jersey. And so few teams have really defined, what is the jersey I'm wearing? And why is that important to me? I think the cord helps us look at some of those aspects. So I think it's helping leaders just realize it's not a one-off. Teams are complex. You got multiple relationships, you got multiple stakeholders. There's lots of dynamics. We know there's challenges, but there's nothing more rewarding. That's why so many of us love team sports. And you know, our career, when I ask leaders about their career best moments, the real highlights, the majority will talk about not being the lone wolf, but being part of something, being part of a team that innovated or brought a new product or changed the market or beat up the customer. But back to your point, as human beings, we're tribe focused. I think many of our career best moments have been in teams where we've really excelled. There's a lovely phrase from someone I read where they said, maybe even let's not talk about high performance. That's kind of not always useful language. Let's talk about teams that are serious fun. Now, that resonated with me now. I've been on teams that were serious fun. We delivered, but we had a great time doing it as well. There was a sense of loyalty. I think that might also be a call to action for all of us on this call is how would you describe the team? And we're members of multiple teams, but would you describe them as serious fun? Would you describe them as not having fun, too serious, or are they even serious enough to deliver on something? So I think
Yeah.
they're all ways of gauging this.
No, you're absolutely right. And the next slide I have there is actually a series of stats from Humu. Did some really interesting research, but you know, there's things there like, you know, the cost of a single bad manager, you know, is $70,000, and that number grows quickly when you compound it. If you think about if the cost of you is $70,000 and you have a series of bad managers across a large organization, you're getting into some serious costing there. But for me, I think the one that really stood out to me is that effective managers create 78% more psychological safety. And we hear an awful lot of talk about psychological safety these days. And part of where my research and my reasoning came to with Accord was that Accord is about building psychological safety, but it's doing it in a way that resonates and works for everyone. I think I feel like personally sometimes that some of the information that's out there, it almost suggests that you have to be a certain type of personality, maybe even a certain type of neuro group, you know, in order to be a great leader, that you have to be able to deliver all these things. When actually the reality is every single individual in an organization comes from a very different background. And some people are, you know, like when you do the DISC, I don't know if you've done the DISC kind of personality testing thing or whatever the psychometric kind of thing out there is, and there's like, oh, you're a very yellow, or you're very red, or you're very blue, or whatever the case may be. We're all very different. But when we talk about things like psychological safety, sometimes the challenge is that some people go, oh, here we go. Now we've got to wrap them in cotton wool and we're not allowed to say anything. And this is getting ridiculous. And now we're going to, you know, like just basically do whatever Gen Z want and all that kind of stuff. One of the things I was thinking about with Accord, and I'm going to explain what the letters of Accord mean now, but one of the things that I was thinking about with that was it's basically the fundamentals around building psychological safety that make your teams more connected, perform better. From your perspective, before we go into the letters, from your perspective when it comes to psychological safety, what's the single biggest piece of advice you give leaders when you're working with them to try and help them understand what the path to psychological safety is like?
Yeah, so there's a few things, and you touched about one of the misconceptions is this is about being nice. So psychological safety is actually a way of having high support and high challenge. Because imagine the opposite. Imagine it's a high challenge environment and there's low support for people. I think we've all been there where you basically you cover up and hope somebody else gets attacked today. And likewise, if it's highly supportive and there's no challenge, that's quite sterile as well. So it is about having enough psychological safety so you can up the challenge. The very work that Amy Ebenson did initially in her research around psychological safety was looking at high performance hospital teams. And she thought initially that the teams who reported the lowest number of errors were the high performing teams. But then she began to realize actually it's the teams who reported the most errors who happened to be the most high performing in perception. And the reason was when we have high psychological safety, we don't hide the truth. We talk about it. We report errors. We put the fish on the table. We have those conversations out. Whereas I think we've all been in teams where, you know, you knew not to say the wrong thing to the boss, or where you knew certain topics were never to be mentioned, or you just sat there and hoped somebody else got it in the neck today and it wasn't you. So low psychological safety stops people being themselves, but it stops robust conversations. So in terms of helping leaders think about this, I think I'm coaching one leader at the moment, and he was complaining to me that his team does not bring up, he looks for ideas, and he says, you know, what do you guys think? And he doesn't get anything back. And he's saying, like, you know, what's going on? They don't bring me any thoughts. And I went, how safe is it to bring ideas for you? What role might you be playing in that dynamic? And he thought about it and said, well, yeah, okay. And he's quite good at reflecting. He said, like, there probably has been times where I have criticized people in front of the team or shot down ideas. And I went, okay, right, it's very honest of you, but what dynamic do you think that's playing out when you ask the next time around any ideas? So I think recognizing that leaders, as your data shows, we have a huge influence on that, but organizational context has a huge influence as well on the level of psychological safety. If it's all about numbers and tasks, that can reduce it as well. So I think it's helping leaders see that this is not being nice. The other question I often get, Niall, is, well, how is psychological safety different from trust? And it is different. Psychological safety is a group experience. So right now, how psychologically safe do I feel with Haley and Niall as a collective feeling? I may well trust Niall. I might not trust Haley. That's different. What's the mood as the three of us are together? Can I be me? Can I take risks? Can I come up with crazy ideas? Trust to me is me having an expectation of you in the future. I trust Pep Talk because they're going to deliver something in the future, or I trust Niall to follow through. Psychological safety is that sense of you giving me the benefit of the doubt now. I won't be laughed at. There won't be some comment to downplay my ideas. And you feel it. We've all felt it in the rooms where you just realized, keep the mouth closed. And that's not productive. The big shot in the arm for psychological safety was the Google research, Project Aristotle, which was reported by Charles Duhigg in the New York Times. And again, as Google looked at what was the key factor that helped teams excel in Google, psychological safety was the most important criteria because it got us into robust conversations, which I think Accord is also trying to do, is how as a leader do I help my team have real conversations about a team as opposed to this is the way we've always done it. So it is vital, and I think it's helping leaders see the value of that through their own experiences of being in low psychological safe environments.
Yeah, God, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it is fascinating that in the environment, like, it's funny that you mentioned there a minute ago about the you know, like how trust and psychological safety are different. And part of what I was looking at was, I mean, I've worked with teams where two-star players didn't talk to each other ever, like literally say good morning to each other. Absolutely dysfunctional in a personal relationship, but both understood their roles so clearly that when they were performing together, they were phenomenal. And, you know, obviously you would prefer if they weren't, you know, like that far apart personally. But the reality was there was enough psychological safety there within the organization that they were both allowed to be who they were because they were able to deliver their performance, and neither were being harmed by it. They were just two very different people. One was very outgoing, very kind of flash, and the other was a quiet family person who just wanted to spend time with their kids. And that's fine. You know, you don't have to have all your team exactly the same or liking each other. And that's kind of what I got to with the idea about Accord, is it's a way to help you build team experience, obviously from a pep talk point of view, but it's a way to help you build psychological safety, connect your team, and have your team performing at a higher level more consistently, and have your leaders performing at a higher level more consistently. So I suppose we've talked about Accord for quite a while now and I haven't really broken down what it is. And that's by design. It's like a big reveal. We're kind of dragging you along, waiting to hear what the actual letters mean. So yeah, so I mean, obviously the A in Accord, it's obviously an acronym, and the words are on screen. The A is about appreciation, and it's one of the areas that we miss, particularly when we're under increasing pressure to deliver on timelines and deadlines. We forget sometimes to acknowledge the people we're working with. And I remember a few years back, I worked in British gymnastics, and the executive director in the HR department, lovely lady who took her role very seriously, But she walked out past her PA one day. And this is something completely unrelated to sports, but it had to do with, it just resonated with me. And this is a long time ago. But she walked out past her PA, and she turned around to her and she said, "Thanks so much for what you did today. I really appreciate it." And she walked off. And then she came back. She remembered something. She came back, and the lady was sitting behind her desk with a tear in her eye. And she's like, "Oh my God, are you okay? Did I say something wrong?" And she goes, "No." She goes, "I've worked for you for 10 years and you've never said thank you before."
Um,
And she took that as she's a good person. She believed in the work she did. She cared about the people who worked for her, but she'd never said thank you. And it sounds ludicrous, and it sounds really lovely and cuddly and fluffy, and and we're all in the real world. But how does showing appreciation, and from your perspective, because I think the reason the A is at the start of the acronym is because I feel it's fundamental to the building of psychological safety, that we acknowledge each other, that we show appreciation, and that it is a way for us to stay honestly connected as a team. And maybe you could share me some thoughts on where that fits into the coaching model of the work you do.
Yeah, and go back to some some fundamental great theories or models out there. The Stephen Covey emotional bank account. That you need to put deposits into an account, a relationship, to make withdrawals influence. So if I'm going to keep asking you to do things for me and I'm not putting deposits in, such as recognition, if I keep withdrawing, the account goes bankrupt. There's that. I guess I'd like to even stretch out appreciation a bit further. There of course is the value of recognition, but something I found, there's been two teams I'm working with at the moment. One is a founder-led organization with some new leadership members in, and another is a team in a hospital. And for both of them, I did an exercise called the clock. And this is for all managers. You can use this. It's there for teams where there's a real spread of length of service. So the founder organization, obviously that founder was first in, and probably it's been like a 15-year journey, and there's various people who came in at various points, and now we've had two new leaders in, hence they're looking at some team coaching. The hospital team, it's even further. Some people there less than a year, some 25 years. And the appreciation I'm getting at is there's a view from family therapy that a system cannot change unless you acknowledge time. Who came first? Imagine your family system and you didn't know who granddad or grandmum was, and you couldn't acknowledge that. Or we didn't have a way of knowing which sibling came first. And so for teams, we often forget. And for both these teams in the last few weeks, I have got them to form a clock. 12 o'clock is, can the person who's been here longest in this team stand there? And then everybody else follow around, who's next, and so on. And the newest people are 11. And then I get a conversation going. And I ask the rest of the clock, what would you like to acknowledge to those who are at 12 or 1 or 2 o'clock, who's been here longest? And then you move around and maybe and you get them to reflect back on what they've heard. And then you ask the middle to the clock to talk about those around 5, 6, 7 o'clock, and then the clock to also speak to those just joined. What do you acknowledge about what they bring? It opens up a conversation with the founder member organization. Many of them had never said to the founder, thank you, or to the founder's number two, who's been there, his right-hand man. I've never said, thank you. Look at the legacy you've created. We wouldn't be here without you. They even also said, we recognize you went through really tough times together and you kept this company together. Thank you. And you could see it touch the older members. Because when I'm a long-term member of a team, I can often feel like my voice gets forgotten. They also recognize the experience there. But vice versa, when the rest of the clock spoke to the new members, it's like, we need you. We need your specialty. If we hadn't been successful, we wouldn't be here now. You bring something different. We want to honor you're not from this system. You bring new thinking. And so I think appreciation is almost recognizing what we all bring in terms of our experiences and the length of time in the team. Because we can often say, there's Niall, he's been here for years. He's just a blocker to change. Or here's Colin, he's trying to change everything. He's barely in the door. I think acknowledging is part of appreciation as well. And then the other thing of appreciation is, I think it's appreciating our stakeholders. No teams are created in isolation. Every team out there has been co-missioned, to use Peter Hawkins' language, co-missioned by a bunch of stakeholders who said, we need a team to deliver something here. And so how as a team do we begin to bring that customer, that stakeholder into the room? That could be an empty chair that has customer written on it. It could be us just standing in that position. But how do we begin to appreciate? I think too much of teamwork is inside out. Here's our charter and we're great, but we never engage or appreciate what's the stakeholder view of us. So for me, it's a key thing. It's not just appreciation of each other, but acknowledgement and also a common understanding of our stakeholders.
Yeah, and it actually sets it up lovely then to move on to the second stage of the model, which is connection.
Yeah.
And it being that there's a lovely piece of research I saw by the Australian College of Applied Psychologists, and they were talking about how people with good connection were happier, less stressed, more engaged at work, and actually even physically healthier. And I think when we talk about connection, it's something that we've always believed in Pep Talk, that connected teams were happier teams, healthier teams, and more and better performing teams. But from your perspective, with you know, again, looking at it with a coaching lens or with your leadership specialty lens on, what would be the practical advice, I suppose, for building that connection between your leaders and your teams?
So this is a really hot topic at the moment. I hear, it's funny, even in the last few days, I've heard a lot about post-COVID and some of the impact that's now really kind of showing up, that we had to get into smaller teams or we had to disconnect to survive. And again, a lot of that stakeholder engagement got lost. I think connection for me is multi-layered. There's a connection with the direction. So how do I connect with a purpose? As well as, I think as human beings, we said it already, we like to be in the middle of something. So how do I connect with the team, but also how do I connect with the people? So I think it's multi-layered. People, there's a potential disconnect going on where many of us are working from home, or we don't see as many colleagues, even if we are in a hybrid environment, and we're probably a bit disconnected from the organization, the team, and its members. But I go back to direction. I think connecting with a purpose is key thing, because again, even with appreciation, the danger is I could go in and tell everybody how wonderful they are, but it has to be sincere, and you almost need the direction and respect for the appreciation to have context. Likewise, connection. I think, you know, why do I need to connect with you unless there's some reason? Back to those two people who didn't get on in that sports team, there was a bigger purpose, which is winning whatever competition it was, or the team excelling. So for me, it's helping leaders look at, how do you help your team connect at different levels? It's not just a personal thing. Are they connected to the purpose? Again, so many teams I work with, especially leadership teams, when you ask them what's the purpose of the team, you get 10 different answers. Or people don't even see a connection. They see it as, I wear my silo jersey. I'm sales, you're marketing, they're accountants, they're finance, someone else's production, and we show up with our different jerseys. And I think, how do I, you know, if there's one analogy, and I hope the word jersey translates to different cultures. I don't know now, you know more about North American sports, but you know, there's a great story in Irish sport, in the sport of rugby, where one of the players, there's two major teams making up the national rugby team, and one of the players opened up an honest conversation saying, I think some of you are more loyal to your club team than you are to this team. And they were disgusted with him, but it opened up a conversation of which jersey are you wearing? And I think in a lot of teams, many of us have not made the transition to wearing the jersey team. We wear the style or functional jersey. And that just adds to really boring meetings and people feeling disconnected. And I'm bored by this conversation because it's between finance and sales, nothing to do with me. Or we think HR is the only people to talk about people. So how do we get teams to connect around the purpose is key in getting teams motivating. The one key thing in any teams is that sense of common direction. What's the purpose? There's a lovely question that Peter Hawkins asks, which is, what do we need to do together that we cannot do apart? Now, again, go back in this evening or tomorrow morning and ask your team, what is it that we need to do together that we can't do apart? Right now on this webinar, Niall doesn't need me to do his job. He doesn't, I don't need him to do my job, but what do we need to do together is open up a conversation. So I think that's core to connection. And then we have the personal piece coming through.
Yeah,
And I think back to that task relationship, I don't think teams spend a lot of time really helping each other to get to know each other better. Where that's personality tools, I can take or leave them, but you
yeah.
know, so many teams I work with, they have a very limited view of each other than the functional role. They don't really know the person.
Absolutely, and it lends itself then into obviously the next step in the model, which is communication. And we're a big believer in, you know, obviously with Pep Talk we do our check-in, which gives us a sense check of where organizations are at and where the people in the organizations are at. But if you're a leader and your team are telling you that they're feeling anxious or they're disconnected or they're lacking in energy or whatever the case may be, you then have information to do something about it. And then we talk about having, you know, once you've done the check-in, to do a team talk where you get a chance to sit down with the team and actually have a human conversation about something other than work, which, you know, sounds ludicrously simple, but, you know, it's often very much missing. And there's a lovely statement from MIT talking about, we've established the patterns of communication as the single most important thing to measure when gauging the effectiveness of a group. And you spoke earlier about listening and the importance of listening. But as a leader and as you built on your conversation of a connection and increasingly you were getting into communication. So tell me a little bit about like a practical little piece of advice for communication.
I think, you know, so much of this is about, as a team, let's have a conversation about what are the norms of communication. So I'm even looking at Tara's question in the chat as well about the hybrid environment. I mean, there is no silver bullet, there's no panacea to it all, but how do we get more explicit with how are we going to communicate when I'm in a hurry and there's a crisis? How are we going to communicate with each other? Do we phone each other? Do we WhatsApp it? But let's get explicit on things. When we're trying to meet and build relationships, you know, let's make sure that is in the office. So I think it's understanding what we're trying to communicate and what's the vehicle that supports it. So much of my curiosity is every team has norms. I mean, what I mean by norms are they're dynamics. So like family, if I go visit someone's family, how you have breakfast is very different to how I might have breakfast, but there's all these rules. And likewise in teams, you know, there's these rules about how we speak, who talks last, how we meet. And I think we need to upgrade the norms. Most norms that I experience in teams are outdated, but they've hung around for a long time, but like family norms.
Hmm.
So, you know, Tara, I think your question about people dropping in and out, I think it's being more explicit on how can we be more intentional about if we're not all in the office all the time, how do we make this work? And I think as a leader, it's having the security to open up that conversation and getting the team to figure it out. Because they're going to be
Absolutely.
more bought in. It's a bit like the challenge many of us face leading virtual teams globally. What's the right time for a meeting when I've got Asia, North America, Europe? I think, well, why as a leader do I need to figure out? Let's get the team to have the conversation. Let's rotate things. But it's laying it out in front of the team. So the more we can talk about how do we make this work based on how we're going to operate. So I think there's a huge value in, and I guess another ask of the audience, when was the last time you spoke about the norms of team membership, the rules of engagement? Think about the first time you ever went to the subway in New York or to the underground in London. What were the norms you learned? Mind the gap. Don't speak to strangers. You can always fit 56 more people into the carriage, even though it's not possible. Or the one where I got trampled, I got stood on the wrong side of the escalator. There I was, the Irish guy in London, thinking, no, just stand here. And it was the wrong norm. The norm was, this is the fast one. What are the norms in your team right now? And which ones are serving you well? And which ones, you may not even realize it, are not serving you well? They may have been useful norms 5, 6 years ago, but they're still hanging around. And unless we get explicit about how are we going to communicate as a dispersed team, you're not going to open up that conversation. So whenever I work with teams, I always get them to create norms for the work with me, but I also ask the question, and which of your norms will get in the way of this work?
Yeah.
So things like, we're going to rush to solution, or we never follow through. The team know it. They know the norms. Any new member in team will be able to tell you within 2 or 3 weeks what are the norms. I had one team recently, and their norm is we put something on the agenda, we spend ages discussing it, we make a decision, and then 2 weeks later, it comes back up on the agenda item again. And once someone said it, they all got it. And yeah, that's absolutely a norm. So we never fully disagree and commit. We pretend we comply with these decisions. And someone backdoors it back up onto the agenda, and they waste so much time. So again, I think I'd love you all to go back and think about what are the norms and have that conversation with your team. And there is a norm around communication. Yeah, how do we talk to each other when we're together and when we're apart? Sorry, Noel, I'm yapping on here. I'm getting excited, but
You can nap on forever, Colin. I could listen to you forever. Unfortunately, not every luxury of time to listen that we do. Yeah, and I mean, like the idea behind Accord, and what I'll do is we've done the first 3 letters: appreciation, connection, communication. The next 3 we can pretty much do together, I think, and trash it up. But we talk about ownership, respect, and direction. And I'm going to give a very quick example of I worked. I mentioned British gymnastics earlier. Well, I worked with a coach called Scott Hahn, and he's gymnast, a guy called Max Whitlock, and they had a phenomenal relationship together. And the reason it was so strong was that Scott gave Max ownership of his own program. Is where do we want to go? He had the respect to give him a voice in the plan. A lot of coaches are very much about, I'll tell you what to do, you go and do it. But these guys worked together, and there was ownership, there was respect. But then the direction. You know, there's that great quote from Alice in Wonderland that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And it's so rare in teams and in organizations that you have clarity about where exactly you're going. It's often kind of like you have a target, but the target is just a measurement. But is that the direction as a team you want to go, or is that just a byproduct of a successful team delivering? So from your perspective with that, and I should also mention, actually, you mentioned Tara's question, which is a really solid question. If anybody has any questions they want to ask, stick them in the chat and we'll happily try and get to them. We're going to give Colin a bit of free reign for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to wrap it up. So yeah, Colin, just from that point of view, thinking about like what I saw there with Scott and Max, it was phenomenal. Like Max is a 3-time Olympic gold medalist now, and Britain never had a gold medal before Rio. So he's probably the greatest pommel horse gymnast of all time now. But achieved so much of that because of his relationship with his coach and how they understood ownership, respect, and direction. So maybe talk to me a little bit about your philosophies on that. I'm going to give you 5 minutes and then I'm cutting you off.
I won't take that. I know Tara has another question. Thanks, Tara. I really appreciate you asking the question. So I have half an eye on that as well. I mean, go back to your story of the coach and the gymnast. I mean, again, we're talking about common purpose, you know, and we often see those relationships breaking when maybe the coach becomes less interested in the athlete and maybe about their stable of athletes, or becomes more interested in being a personality profile themselves, right? So I think that sense of the core thing of teams, and it goes back to direction, is that sense of what's the commonality. You know, if we are just coming together because we've got the same manager and there's no common purpose, we're just a group, which is fine, nothing wrong with groups. It's slightly less sexy than teams, and I think we call everything teams these days, right? You know, Team GB, Team Ireland, Team USA. I mean, they're not teams. They're 60, 100 athletes who all happen to wear the same singlet, but the boxers are not dependent on the gymnast, right? So teams are, Group GB wouldn't be quite as sexy, right, as a profile. So I think we have to be careful we don't name everything teams. There is high performing groups. I've seen them, sales teams. Okay, I might get a bit flack for this, but I have rarely met real teams in sales teams, because I've got a quota and Niall's got a quota, and if I'm successful and he's not, I'm still successful. Now, there are sales teams where we're bound into an overall target, that helps, but teams need to have that commonality of purpose, and there needs to be interdependency. See with my fingers here. So even what you're describing with those two individuals, they've got a common purpose of the gymnast being successful, and they've got that interdependence with each other. which is hard. You always have to keep working on it. And I think, again, I think I've said a few things here. The ownership is that jersey, you know, and the norms. If we're in a team and we're clear on the norms and why we need each other, it allows us to hold each other accountable. And direction. Would all of your team agree the direction of this team? Would they agree on the purpose? Would your stakeholders agree on that? Because the other thing is, it's all very well us saying, yeah, we're driving the bus this direction, and our stakeholders are going, where are they off to? We need them to go this way and bring us with them. So I think there's, you know, real importance of getting that clarity on what is the purpose of this team. Tara's asking, can any team become high performing? I guess I would ask the question, well, firstly, do you need to be a team? I think that's a really great conversation to have with your team. Do we need to make, because why do I ask that? Teams take effort, they take sacrifice. You know, if I'm a team with Niall, he may have to be a bit better looking and clever and funnier today than I have to be, but it's good for the team, right? You know, so I take one for the team, or it's an effort. We have to make sure we stay aligned and talk to each other. If we're just a group of people and we're sharing best practice, that's useful for me to go back and do my individual job, but there's no collective need. So I think, Tara, one question would be, does the team need to be a team? Are there interdependencies we need to deliver on? And can they all become high performing? I think in concept, yes, but what gets in the way? I guess it is lack of clarity, lack of direction, lack of openness. So there's lots of things getting in the way, but I guess before we get to high performing team, I'd like to figure out, does the team really need to be a team? There are also high performing groups. I've certainly seen sales groups who have performed really well. They share best practice, but I go back and do my sales job really well. I don't need to pass the ball to everybody else. So, and I think high performance, again, high performance excites many of us. It's got a very sporting idea behind it. We like the idea. I think a more native or more natural thing is, how do we have serious fun? I think that captures a lot of high performance, right? We're serious because we're getting the job done, but there's a fun aspect. And for many of us, the best teams we've been in, we delivered, but it was viable. We could keep the team going for a number of years. We didn't kill each other in getting over the line. And I learned a lot. There's a commitment to each of our learning. So it's a high bar, but I think for many of us, it's worth the journey to get our teams upping that level. Hopefully
Absolutely.
That wasn't.
I think the ambition that I had when I designed the Accord, and where Pep Talk believe in Accord as the foundation pillars of a great team experience, is that what Accord gives you is the practical application of the characteristics and behaviors of what a great team are. And to be high performing, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be high performing at an Olympic level. It can be just that you're delivering the best things that you're capable of at any given time. And really what we've done is we've identified 6 key steps to increase psychological safety, build team culture, engagement, performance, and then ultimately your team experience. And Colin, I want to thank you today for absolute pearls of wisdom, brilliant stuff as always. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully people will appreciate the fact that I believe you've brought Accord to life today, and I really value your time. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you to everyone for listening. It's been a pleasure to have another Pep Talk live webinar with you. And I just want to call out that we have our next webinar coming up on the 28th of March. So we're cramming them in this month. And that's going to be with Tara, John, and Mark, talking about the TX score and the brilliance of some work that the guys are doing around helping us measure the impact of what are traditionally being dismissed as soft skills, but actually I believe are essential skills. And it's all part of what Pep Talk believes in building great teams, great team experience, and ultimately more successful organizations. So thank you for listening. Thank you, Colin, for joining us, and we'll see you guys on the 28th.